Welcome to Relish Books. Today I am talking about the question, when is it okay to quit reading a book? When is it okay to give up on a book, essentially? And as a reader, I feel like this is an important question and something that everybody probably has a little bit of a different opinion on, so I'm just going to give my thoughts and opinions. I've heard a lot of different opinions, different kind of rule sets, so I'm just going to give what I kind of try to go by. I've heard a lot of people say, like, if you're not into it by 50 pages or something like that. But I think the first thing to address is that there are not the same rules for every book. The first thing you have to establish is your reason for reading that particular book, what kind of book it is, why you're reading it, what you want to get out of it, and then you can apply your rules after that. Because if you're reading, I feel like most of the common rules that you hear are applied to books that you're just reading for pleasure. If you're just reading something for enjoyment, to be entertained, then yes, it's fine to quit if you don't like it after a certain number of pages. If it's boring, if you hate it, whatever. If you're just reading for enjoyment, you're just reading for entertainment, I think it's totally fine to quit a book just a little way in. But I feel like for serious readers, you're almost never reading just for enjoyment, just for just to be entertained. I feel like serious readers are willing to put in more effort, and so that makes it harder to know when to quit. Because, like, for me, I have a really hard time quitting a book. There are lots of times when I really want to, when I really feel like it, when reading is difficult, but I feel really bad about quitting. No matter what it is, even if I start a book and it's awful, I don't feel good about not finishing it. And I think part of it is because I have this idea, like, that if I start a book and I put in a few hours or whatever and then quit, it just feels like a complete waste of time, because I can't count that book. I can't say that I've read the book unless I actually finished it. I feel like I'm not qualified to have an opinion on it or talk about it, which is really frustrating if it's a book that you hate and you want to share your opinion and be like, yeah, I really hated that book. But even if you really believe that it's a horrible book, I feel like you can't genuinely give an opinion on it. I think there are exceptions, and I'll get to that a little bit later, but I feel like I can't really give an opinion on any book, for sure, unless I've read it. I can give opinions on genres and, things in general, types of books in general. Like, I feel qualified to trash, like, pretty much all young adult novels without having read them, because that's in general, and I know there are exceptions. I don't ever feel like, even though I feel like I can, I wouldn't just trash a specific young adult novel without having read it. So I feel like there's this waste of time if I don't finish a book, even if it's terrible, which is it's not super smart to have that opinion, because even if you do finish it, if it's an awful book, then you've just wasted more time. So yes, you can say that you didn't like it, you can have an opinion on it, but it was really a waste of time, and you would have been better employed reading something else. So there's that. But I do think there are a lot of times, so if you're reading just for enjoyment, purely for enjoyment, that's one thing. There are times, though, a lot of different things that you're reading, and I am still only talking about fiction, because nonfiction is a whole different thing. But there are times when you're reading fiction for educational purposes. There are times when you're reading it, like maybe for assignments. There are times that you're reading it because you want to challenge yourself and you want to do something difficult. So just because a book is difficult or boring doesn't mean you should quit on it, because maybe your purpose in reading it is to build your endurance as a reader, is to expose yourself maybe to a new genre. Like if you haven't read, I've heard plenty of people, some people, talk about reading like Jane Austen or Charles Dickens for the first time, and they really don't like it. And that's hard for me to understand because I'm very used to that style. Because I've been reading that style for a long time. But just because you don't like it at the beginning, even like for a whole book, doesn't mean that you're not gonna get used to that. I think with books that have older language, if you're not used to that, you have to get your mind into the groove of it. You have to get used to the sound of that language. And I think once you do, you might like, some people just don't like those kind of books. But I think that they should be given a chance. I don't think, if you're like, oh, I want to try Jane Austen for the first time, and you start one and you don't like it, you shouldn't quit, because your reason is that you want to try this. You're not just reading something that's just going to be easy entertainment. I mean, for some people, those books are. For some people, they're not. So it really depends on where you're coming from. There are plenty of classics that I've read that I really didn't like, but I am glad that I read them. So I think that's a good question to ask yourself too, is like, am I going to be glad that I read this afterward? The types of books that I usually quit reading are modern books, more contemporary stuff that aren't like super, super well known, so I don't really feel like there's any reason for me to have read them to be able to talk about to people. Just something that I was trying for fun, for something different. And if it's not doing anything for me, I'm not enjoying it, it's not something that is going to feel like an accomplishment to have finished, then I think it's totally fine to quit. I still feel really bad about it. I feel bad any book that I quit. But I think there is a time and place for it. And I also think that if you give it a really solid effort, you didn't just read the first few pages, you really put in some effort and you really got the feel for it. Maybe, and this is a huge reason that I would quit reading a book, if the writing is just terrible. And that's something that you can know almost immediately. Because if you start a book and it's boring, there's a good chance it'll pick up. So many classics are that way. They feel boring at the beginning, and as you go deeper, they become more and more and more interesting. So that's a reason to keep going. But if you don't like the writing and you read for a while, that's the way the writing's going to be. The writing's not going to improve throughout the book. That's a very, very rare thing. What you see at the beginning is what you're going to have at the end when it comes to the quality of writing. So if the writing is just garbage, I would quit a book for that reason. Unless it's something that I'm reading for a specific purpose. Maybe, if you have the purpose of discussing bad writing, it can be helpful for that. But if you're reading it for enjoyment and it's written bad, I think it's fine to quit. Obviously, another big thing is content. If you have issues with certain kinds of content, that is probably the most difficult one for me to determine, because I do try to have rules about what kind of content I will read, but they're not hard and fast rules. It's a difficult topic. Everybody has to find their different, their own different boundaries. But once you make those rules, then you got to try to be consistent with yourself, which can be hard. And also, I think for me, it's hard because I have like an idea of rules, but I don't have like hard and fast rules. Like, I don't want to just say, I'm not going to read a book that has swearing in it, because there are so many absolutely incredible books that have that. But at the same time, I don't want to read a book where it's just gratuitous. Like, there are different scenarios. This is what I mean about like books not being equal. And this is stuff that obviously everybody knows, but it can be hard to apply it when you're reading, because it can feel like you're contradicting yourself, because I will read one book that maybe has a lot of language and I won't read another that has some of the same language. But I think you can tell when you're reading a book, you can really feel a lot of the time the author's purpose. Sometimes the way they use language feels very different. Sometimes it genuinely feels like they're just using it in the story. It's not an insane amount or whatever. And then sometimes you can tell that they're just putting it in on purpose to make it as like gritty as possible. You know, if I open a book and right away it has, you know, I remember opening There by Tommy Orange. There's like 40 something like F words in the first couple pages. That tells me immediately that's a book I don't want to read. I don't care what the story is saying, because he's going for something. He's going for a tone. He's purposely setting a tone that I know that I don't want to read. So that actually makes it easy, but that doesn't mean that I will never read a book that has the F word in it. But I feel like like I said, I feel like you can tell if you're reading, if you're reading along and you're like, yes, there's language, but you feel like it's part of the story, so to speak, which I will say, I've never read a book that didn't have cursing in it that I was like, oh, that doesn't feel real because it doesn't have cursing. That doesn't happen, right? I know that people use that language in real life. That doesn't mean a book is going to feel fake because it doesn't have that language. In a book, the purpose of the dialogue is to sound real without actually being real. We all know that. We know that dialogue in books cannot match real life speaking because it would be insufferable. You wouldn't be able to read it. So it has to have the essence of reality. Great dialogue in book has the essence of reality. It feels real while being so much leaner than real dialogue in the world is. And so, yeah, I've never read a book where I missed the cursing, so to speak. But there are books where, you know, that feels normal. And then there are books where you're reading it and you're like, even though I know that some people really talk like this, it feels fake. There's so much. It feels so heavy-handed. Even if people would actually speak like that, if it stands out to me and it feels fake because there's so much, then I feel like the author is just, you know, is going too far on purpose for making the book gritty, for trying to reach maybe a certain audience. And I personally am not that audience. So that's my thing on language. Like, I read books with language. I just don't want it to be gratuitous. And then other things are even harder. I talked about this a bit before. For me, it's all about, again, intention of the author, how they handle things. I'm not going to not read a book that has adult themes or, you know, some romance, if you know what I mean. But at the same time, I don't ever want to read a book that's writing maybe those intimate scenes in a way that's clearly writing them not for the purpose of the story, but for the enjoyment of the reader. And I personally have a problem with that. So I'm not going to read a book that has a lot of scenes like that are graphic, that are not part of the story really, but are just put there to, for the reader to enjoy, like, the smut genre. I don't want anything to do with any of that. And even books that aren't in that kind of genre, but are still doing that it's like a huge part of the story that would not have to be there, that doesn't advance the plot or the characters, just any of those things to excess. That's kind of my rule. And again, all depends on why it's there, how it works in the story, how the author presents it. Again, I don't want to have hard and fast rules on it because there are so many stories where those things are there and they're handled in a way that's real and in a way that's respectful. So that's kind of how I feel about those things, but everybody has to make their own calls on those. But I feel like I have those rules, but it can be hard to be consistent because it's hard to quit reading a book. And so my last rule that I try to really have for myself is if you're reading a book, even if you're enjoying it, if you're reading a book that makes you feel bad about yourself, like as a person, you're reading it and you really feel like, oh, I shouldn't be reading this. Like, I should probably stop. Even if you don't want to, that means you probably should. So like maybe the writing is really good. Maybe the story is interesting and it's drawing you in, but it just makes you feel like a bad person. Then it's not worth it. Like, I love a good story, but there's enough great books out there that you don't have to compromise and read ones that make you feel bad. So those are kind of my rules. And as a final thought, I'm going to share an example of a book that I actually just quit reading. I haven't quit a book. Like, I take breaks from books pretty often, but that's not the same as quitting. Like, I take breaks from classics a lot, and I think that's totally fine. Like, I'm going to come back to them. But I actually quit reading a book the other day, and it was hard. It was mostly hard because, like, I didn't like the book that much. It was mostly hard to stop because I'd pushed myself, and I kept going, kept being like, well, maybe there's worth in here, maybe there's value in the story in here. And I read half of it. So having read half of it, it's hard to be like, it feels like a waste. It feels like I've wasted that time, and now I feel like I can't really talk about the book. I will say, though, if it's a shorter book, and you read half of it, you feel like you know where the story's going, you know the type of story it is, you know the content that it has. I do think you're allowed to judge it pretty fully at that point. Not on every level, but I think you're allowed to have an opinion. That's what I'm going to say. But anyway, the book, this cover is atrocious. If you've watched my videos, you know how I feel about covers with photographs, especially from like movies that have been made of the story. They're awful. But anyway, The Hours by Michael Cunningham. I picked this up because it is inspired by Mrs. Dalloway, which is one of my all-time favorite novels. And I was hoping it was going to be like, inspired by it. I like reading books that are inspired by other books that I like. I do not like reading books that are retellings or things from one of the characters that you don't really see like their point of view. That kind of stuff verges on fan fiction, and I hate that. I feel very passionately about that. It's like, write your own story. Take inspiration from other authors. All authors have to do that. But write your own story. Don't use their work as the springboard for your work. And I feel like this book does do that. So that's the first thing I didn't like about it. It does get better as it goes on, as far as like just heavily taking from Mrs. Dalloway. But that's the whole setting. The whole premise is Mrs. Dalloway. There's even like long passages from the book. And I'm like, leave that book alone. That book is a masterpiece. You think you can match it? You can never match it. But yeah, it's about these 3 different women in 3 different time periods. Virginia Woolf, and hers was the most interesting. That was the one I was like, okay, I would have liked it if you had written a book about Virginia Woolf writing Mrs. Dalloway. That's interesting. And that could be like, historical fiction almost. And that could be fun. But then there are these 2 fictional characters. They were really throwing me off at first because one of them's name is Clarissa. And there are other characters around her who have some of the same names from Mrs. Dalloway. So I was like, at first I was like, what's going on here? Is this actually? And he's writing about her day, almost like the way that Mrs. Dalloway starts. Like she's going to get flowers for a party. And I was like, what's going on here? This is very weird. And then, but yeah, she is her own character. Her name just happens to be Clarissa. And she just happens to be sort of living like Mrs. Dalloway. And then there's this third character who's like just like a woman. She's like a wife, a homemaker, and she's like struggling with that. And she ties in, I'm not positive because I didn't finish the book, but I'm pretty sure I could see where it was going. Pretty sure because with the different time periods, pretty sure her son is one of the main characters in one of the other women's timelines. So you can kind of see where that's going to tie in. The writing was decent. Like, I think it's pretty good, honestly. And it grew on me. The writing did a little bit. But at the same time, it feels almost like he's trying to kind of recapture his own Mrs. Dalloway. He's trying to do it in that style. And like I said, you have to make your own style, because you might be capable as a writer of writing something equally good but different. But if you just try to emulate a style of one of the great writers, it's just going to be less than. It's just going to be not as good, even if it's good. So that bothered me, how much he was drawing from Mrs. Dalloway. I'm like, go think of your own story with 3 women. Like, do your own thing. Don't take from somebody else's work. And then the feeling that he's trying to compete, almost kind of trying to do it in the same style. There was a lot of over description. It's like, okay, you told me that she put the flower in the blue bowl. That's a good line. You don't need to now go on for the next 5 sentences describing all the details on the bowl, like the swirls and the one little chip in it that somehow makes it perfect, when that's not something that's going to tie in later. It's just to try to give it this, trying to give it a tone, and it feels overdone. So a lot of over description. And then the content, I was just like, for one thing, I was confused. I was like, what's going on here? What's he trying to say here? It just was not a book that was working for me. It is not a book that's a classic. It's not a book that I care about. It's not a book that I particularly, have any reason to really finish. And even as I was getting more interested in some of the characters in the story, it was not making me feel very good about myself to read. I was like, you know what? This is kind of icky. Some of the stuff that they're talking about, some of the world views that are coming through. And it can be hard to pinpoint that. Like Mrs. Dalloway deals with some of the same themes, but it's done beautifully. The whole point of Mrs. Dalloway is giving significance and importance to these everyday things, to a woman going about her day, going about planning a party and saying, hey, this day in a woman's life is as worthwhile to read about in a novel as great world events. She pulls that off, and she does it amazingly, in my opinion. I feel like he's trying to do the same thing. He's trying to elevate normal, everyday things. People without any real conviction in the world, people without any real direction or beliefs, trying to navigate their lives. But he doesn't do it with the same grace. There's a difference between giving those things significance and saying, I don't know how to put it. It's almost like Mrs. Dalloway is saying, look, these little things matter. And it's almost like The Hours is saying, nothing really matters. However you want to live your life, however you want to express yourself, whoever you want to be with, however many people you want to be with, whatever makes you feel good is right and important, but nobody's really happy. And it's like, okay, well, and it's like they're searching, they're lost, but they're not really searching because they think they already have the answers. They think it doesn't really matter what you do. They think the basic elements of life are all that there is. The basic pleasures of life are all that there is. So there's nothing more. There's nothing more to the book. It's like, yes, I could connect with these people who are struggling with these normal everyday things. I could connect with that if there was something deeper, if there was a search, if there was this feeling like Nothing really matters. Whatever you do is totally fine. And yet, everyone's unhappy and the world kind of stinks. That's the way that this book made me feel. And I don't like that. I don't need that in my life. It didn't feel like he was ever going to say anything meaningful, that it was ever really going to change. If anybody has read the book and is like, oh, it has an amazing ending, maybe I'll go ahead and finish it since I already read the first half. But yeah, my point just being, I didn't appreciate the book. I didn't appreciate the setting. I didn't appreciate what it was saying, the tone that it gave, the kind of messages it was sending, even though I don't really know if it was trying to send messages. Every book has a bias. Every single book, even if the whole point of the book is to not be biased, every book is coming from a person's perspective. And so every book is going to be biased in some way. And so that's just something you have to deal with when you're reading. But if it does nothing for you, you've given it a good chance, doesn't make you feel good, I think it's fine to quit. So anyway, those are just some random thoughts that I've been having as I, thought about whether I should stop this book, whatever. And it's a question that I've asked myself over and over, over the years reading. So those are my thoughts and opinions. Let me know what you think. If you think you should just finish a book no matter what, if you're fine with just quitting, if you don't like it, let me know. Thanks so much for watching. Appreciate anybody who made it to the end of this long video. I will see you next time. Bye.